Good morning. I'm Mike Van Dusen, Executive Vice President of the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I want to welcome you here. It's good to see all of you so early in the morning. I know you're going to have a wonderful day. This conference today is organized in cooperation with the Romanian Cultural Institute, University of Maryland, College Park, and Georgetown University, and the Romanian Embassy, a collaborative effort. It's a third in a series looking at the legacies of communism in Europe. This is part of a larger cooperative agreement between the Romanian Cultural Institute and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, which includes our ongoing short-term Romanian Scholar Program. We consider this scholar program to be extraordinarily successful in its first year, and we're looking forward to bringing other exceptional Romanian scholars to the center in the coming years. I would like to welcome and thank and recognize Horia Roman Patapayevich, President of the Romanian Cultural Institute, and the Vice President of the Romanian Cultural Institute, Mircea Mihaiaș. And also welcome back Vladimir Tismaneanu, Professor of Government, University of Maryland, Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, and former Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and a good friend and been of enormous help to 2 or 3 of our programs here over the years. And I believe Bogdan Jakub of the Romanian Cultural Institute is also with us. I do not think Ambassador Adrian Veritsa is here yet, but I know he will be here a good bit of the day. And I think I should recognize and thank Christina Gaginski at the Romanian Embassy for all of her help in putting this together. And finally, Christian Osterman, who is practically ready to get on a plane, and his excellent staff, Mircea Montanu and Christina Tervesa and Tim McDonald, all helped to bring us where we are today. Now, I think I'm meant to turn this over to Vladimir Tismaneanu. Hoya. Come on up, and I hope you have a good day. And again, thank you for being here, and I know it will be productive. Good to see you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Michael van Dusen. Quite naturally, I cannot add something more to the thanks made by Michael van Dusen. I salute you all. I think that our two-day events go on very well. Yesterday, discussions and contributions were outstanding in my view. So I very warmly welcome you for this second day of our event and our third day of collaboration with the Woodrow Wilson Center for such events. I thank you.
It's a great privilege to be back here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I think it's, for me, I think the first time I gave a talk at the Woodrow Wilson Center was in 1988 or 87. And it's quite funny because in my Securitate file, I could find the report by one of the Securitate moles about how I influenced the views of this quite eccentric professor from California. His name was Ken Jowett. Okay, so Securitate. Okay, so it's a great moment to be here. What I'd like to do is to say that indeed I fully share Horia Patapievich's assessment as being the organizer of convener together with Christian Osterman and Horia. We are the 3 conveners of the conference. Whether you like it or not, you are. Okay, and I'm really very excited by this day. The reason I asked humbly to have the floor for 3 minutes is that yesterday, luckily, we got the DHL from Budapest, and I want to promote. You have already the the flyers and the order forms. This is the volume, based on what I mentioned. This is the third year of cooperation between the Romanian Cultural Institute, Maryland, Woodrow Wilson Center, and Georgetown. Thank you, Charles, by the way. Okay, and this is the first volume that just came out. It's going to be officially launched at AAASS in Boston on Saturday. So those who happen to be in Boston, Bogdan, what hour is it? 9 o'clock at the CEU booth at the book exhibition in Boston. And I'm very happy that some of the contributors are here. It's CEU Press, it's the Stalinism Revisited, the Establishment of Communist Regimes in East and Central Europe. I want to emphasize the whole purpose of this project that the Cultural Institute started, and Horia and Mircea and Tanya Radu and the other leaders of the Institute have been very enthusiastic, and the president of the country has been very enthusiastic. This is basically bringing together Romanian scholars and East European scholars. We tried very hard to have scholars from the other East European countries as well. János Reiner is involved in this project, who is the director of the 56th Institute in Budapest, and so on and so forth. What we tried is to bring together Romanian and East European scholars in general and communicate, establish bridges with their peers in the United States and Western Europe. So that's the reason we have this try to have global perspectives, and that's the reason I was very, very keen on including the Romanian papers, and I'll do the same thing for all the other volumes, because I think this is, in the epistemic community we are pleased to belong to, the flow of ideas and the communication of ideas is very important. I was mentioning to Gail Stokes before, when we were chatting, I think there was the exception of Albania. No other country has been so punished by cultural autarky as Romania was punished especially in the 1980s, and no other professions within the scholarly professions were so much harassed and persecuted as the humanities, especially history, political science, political philosophy in general, sociology. And this is a very important effort, I think, to try to fill the gap as soon as possible. So I want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for the program. We already had, this is the third fellow here, and there will be other fellows coming, historians, philosophers, theologians, economists, who are spending 3 months in Washington, part of this program. I think it's a fantastic program. Thank you very much and good luck.
Thanks very much, Vladimir. We will move to the first panel of the morning. I'm Charles King from Georgetown University. It's a very exciting panel with 4 important and extremely well-done papers. I am in the role of both chair and discussant. I'm going to chair more than I discuss, I think, because I'd like to have a maximum opportunity at the end of the formal presentations of the papers for all of us to have an engaged conversation about them. This session will run until 11, and I would ask each of the presenters to stick to the traditional 20 minutes, if you don't mind, and then I'll pass a piece of paper down the table when you're getting close. We are doing 4 papers, aren't we? Or are we just doing 3? I guess we're just doing 3. In any case, we have Vlad Zubok from Temple University, Tom Gallagher from the University of Bradford, Konrad Jarosz from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I guess Tom Blanton is not participating in this panel. In any case, the 3 papers. So we'll start, and we'll go in the order in which the papers are listed on the program, and we'll start with Vlad Zubok on Gorbachev and the road to 1989.
Thank you, Charles. It's a great honor, of course, to be here on this day and participate in this distinguished conference, and I congratulate all the organizers of the Romanian Cultural Institute and the Wilson Center, who pioneered this effort. And in many ways, I face an impossible task because 20 minutes obviously is not enough to explain the Gorbachev phenomena, and even less to link this phenomena to Gorbachev's behavior in 1989. I would say Soviet behavior, because I sometimes find it puzzling when all events in 1989 which happened to the east of certain divide attributed to Gorbachev. All good things are attributed to Gorbachev. All bad things are attributed to the Russians. So in my paper, I explore the radical transformation of Gorbachev's views and also the new thinkers, people who surrounded him, like Alexander Yakovlev, like Anatoly Chernyaev, Nikolai Shishkin, Georgy Shakhnazarov, about a dozen of reform-minded communists around him. I explore the evolution of their views on security and ideology that made them quite willing to contemplate revolutionary changes in Eastern Europe, and also paradoxically left them, Gorbachev and his lieutenants, completely passive and unprepared when those changes actually began to happen. I will briefly discuss how Gorbachev and his entourage discarded the revolutionary imperial paradigm of Stalinism, and how this devalued in their eyes the role of Eastern Europe, previously considered as the largest prize that the Soviets had gotten after the victory in the Second World War. Then I'll take a look at the domestic situation of the Soviet Union, because my argument is it was domestic crisis, economic, fiscal, and political, that conditioned the reactions of Gorbachev and new thinkers to the events in Eastern Europe. And it deserves special comment because I don't think that it was only material constraints that prevented Gorbachev's interference into the affairs of Eastern Europe, but his whole concept of perestroika related to the events inside the Soviet Union definitely was important. And but it's true that Gorbachev and his reform-oriented entourage by 1989 focused completely on the domestic crisis and on the rapprochement with the West, essentially forgetting, quote-unquote, Eastern Europe and leaving Warsaw Pact allies to their own devices. And finally, if I have time, I will dwell a little bit on the reactive and passive nature of Gorbachev's response to unexpectedly rapid changes in Eastern Europe. These reactions were in part, only part, dictated by structural crisis and ideological changes, and also in part were the result of Gorbachev's personality, overconfident and remarkably ad hocist. First, the question about Gorbachev's geo-ideological revolution. From the very beginning, and the more I read new documents that keep coming out, surprisingly, even lately, about perestroika and Gorbachev, I see that Gorbachev in a very narrow circle, not all of his lieutenants, but some of his lieutenants, envisaged perestroika as a far-reaching project of transforming the Soviet Union. But it's inaccurate to view this project through liberal lenses as a big leap to democratization, as some historians and scholars view it. In my estimate, it may be wrong, but that to this day I think it's true, it was rather an attempt to restage a socialist revolution from above, using the power of gigantic party-state apparatus to reform the Soviet state, society, and economy from deviations accumulated from Stalin to Brezhnev. It was a great gamble, or even better said, a grand illusion by Gorbachev and his reform-oriented lieutenants. But it can better explain the zigzags and ultimate failures of Gorbachev's policies before during and after 1989 than the liberal democratization approach to these events. In retrospect, Gorbachev's perestroika comes out as a stunningly bold but also elitist and misguided revolution, an attempt to reform the state-regulated Soviet economy. It's also a global strategy to end the threat of nuclear war. Here, actually, he succeeded, by the way. And a messianic dream to restore the potency of socialism within the Soviet Union. Here, he dismally failed. Also, it was an idealistic project to integrate the Soviet Union and Russia as a bulk of the Soviet Union into the common European home. Here, he failed, and we see the results of this failure to this day. Anyway, Gorbachev's assumptions and dispositions played a primary role in the geopolitical revolution of 1985-88 conducted from the Kremlin. The geopolitical part of that revolution was basically the conviction of Gorbachev and his new thinkers that another major war in Europe, not to mention nuclear war, was simply unthinkable. And that resulted in 1986-87 in dramatic change of Soviet military doctrine, pushed entirely by Gorbachev and his new thinkers down the throat of the Soviet military, who resisted en masse to this change. But as a result of this shift, Eastern Europe no longer played the role as a glacis or a bulwark or a foreground for Soviet military activities in Europe. Even more important was ideological part of this shift, this transformation. People often focus on the Brezhnev doctrine as a central part of the Soviet Stalinist revolutionary imperial paradigm. The erosion of this ideological component occurred also in 1986-87, largely through the successes of Gorbachev's Glasnost and the release of archival documents, even more publications by writers, poets, new films, especially Tengiz Abuladze's remarkable film Repentance, that was released at the end of '86, produced the second de-Stalinization shock among Soviet officials that should be reappraised, because some people who surrounded Gorbachev somehow didn't remember the first shock under Nikita Khrushchev, or managed to forget it. After '65, any mention of Stalin in negative context was impossible. So this was a remarkable second shock that basically undercut the ideological foundation, a moral foundation of the Soviet, the entire Soviet project. So no longer Eastern Europe was viewed as indispensable proof for inevitable victory of socialism, because the very nature of that socialism was questioned. And by the end of 1988, you see basically that the revolutionary imperial paradigm was in tatters, and it was replaced by an entirely new project that came about as a result of Gorbachev's thinking and writing. There was new thinking, of course, and the most tangible, or rather I would say intangible, but also quite visible expression of this new thinking was the idea of a common European home. It was initially being seen. It was initially seen in the West, and maybe justifiably so, as a rhetorical device, as an attempt to split NATO, maybe. But it gradually became clear that this was not only a rhetorical project; it was the essence of perestroika. And by the end of '88, Gorbachev began to see that project as an essential precondition for the success of domestic reforms in the Soviet Union. And this was related to a great extent, aside from Gorbachev's own evolution as a thinker, it was related to deteriorating domestic crisis in the Soviet Union itself, primarily fiscal, but also the realization that the perestroika, initially considered to be domestic reform, did not succeed, that it lacked traction, lacked support inside the country. And there were, quick and hectic reappraisals within Gorbachev's inner circle that ended up in looking at the West as the most natural ally of perestroika. A very dramatic turnabout, not simply stopping to see the West as an enemy in the Cold War. That would be quite understandable and appropriate, but instead a complete somersault regarding the West as perhaps the only external force that could save perestroika from, whatever domestic enemies, its own doldrums, financial crisis, and so on and so forth. So that was quite remarkable. Taking a quick look at what happened inside the Soviet Union before 1989 and during 1989, it's quite clear when 1989 began that Gorbachev became a most popular man internationally, but was in serious trouble inside the Soviet Union. When he met with Western leaders, he was relaxed. He basked in the glory of his popularity. When he was at home, he faced increasingly angry crowds who asked him about empty shelves and deteriorating economic and financial crisis. And that crisis, unfortunately, was to a great extent the result of Gorbachev's actions or inactions. Soviet economy and finances were in pretty dreadful shape, of course, by 1985, and the fall of the oil prices after 86 added to it. But lack of bold financial reform, fiscal reform contributed to the problems, and also what Gorbachev and especially his Lieutenant Alexander Yakovlev admitted later in 1989 that instead of making bold financial reform sooner rather than later, preventing hyperinflation, stabilizing finances, they began to issue more money. And that money was, there was a lot of money in 1989 in the hands of Soviet citizens, but there were no goods. Against this background, you begin to understand why, at the same time in 86, 87, basically at the initiative of Gorbachev and Soviets, the actual dismantlement of Comecon began. And that dismantlement proceeded quietly, but in retrospect, it's striking that basically the Kremlin, shifted the entire internal trade within Comecon from the special ruble equivalent to dollars and hard currency, and basically agreed that it should be equal trade, and even proposed to reduce the amount of interblock trade. It was a complicated process, but largely because of the growing Soviet economic and financial crisis, and because they wanted to gain more money by selling their oil on international markets, the amount of interblock trade began to shrink. And all of this basically led to the quiet erosion of Comecon, at least a year before political changes in Eastern Europe began in 1989. It's a remarkable development, and it was as if the Kremlin was giving a complete green light to Eastern European countries, whoever wanted it, to reorient themselves to the West. They already actually were doing it since the 70s, but economically and financially they were unhooked in 1987, 88. Another important thing that, of course, happened in the Soviet Union as perestroika was failing in 1988, the reformers began to imagine future troubles ahead. For them, I repeat, it was a socialist revolution from above. And at any moment, as they looked back to Russian history of 1917, 1922, that revolution could evolve into a bloody civil war. So if you look at the political mental map of Gorbachev and some of his followers, by no means all, you begin to see growing fears and worries, basically historicizing the moment of change in 88, 89 in the familiar tropes and expressions of the Russian Revolution. Anatoly Chernyaev, himself ethnic Russian and foreign policy advisor to Gorbachev, recorded in his diary in November 1988 his dark forebodings. Fanaticism, hysteria has overwhelmed everything rational. He was talking about Soviet politics and Soviet society. Another Czechoslovakia of 1968 is coming, or Finland of 1918. This is a remarkable, these are remarkable metaphors. Of course, 1968 is a military intervention in Eastern Europe, and Finnish events in 1918 is a civil war, a very bloody civil war between the whites and the reds. From Chernyaev's perspective of 1988, and it's not by no means Chernyaev's perspective himself, it was widely shared by reform-minded communists and non-communists in Moscow and the big cities of Russia. The threat was a Russian radical nationalism, or, not using the word lightly, Russian fascism. Against this background, another thing that mattered for Eastern European context was the relationship between Gorbachev and his key new thinking advisors and the Soviet military. The relationship was already strained as Gorbachev reformulated radically Soviet military doctrine. The military didn't like it. In fact, Gorbachev had to convince Marshal Sergei Akhrameyev to be his military advisor to modify the relationship with the military. Shevardnadze was openly hated by the military. Gorbachev did not protect Shevardnadze, but clearly stood on Shevardnadze's side in this growing rift. As during the first month of 1989, especially in April 1989, the Soviet military were used in ethnic clashes. First, in Tbilisi, Georgia, Gorbachev did not support the military. He actually expressed the view that no military force should be used, both outside the Soviet Union and inside the Soviet Union. So then again, the mental mapping of Gorbachev and other believers of perestroika, and even in the first month of 1989, was the following. There were supporters and friends of perestroika, themselves, of course, and the progressive part of the Soviet intelligentsia. The West was a key ally to perestroika. On the side of the enemies were everyone else, the majority of the party apparatus, bureaucracy, and the military, who was suspected to organize a coup against Gorbachev at any time, in the way General Kornilov did against Alexander Kerensky in 1917. So fast forwarding, because I have 2 minutes, I believe, and a half. Fast forwarding to the events of in 1989, what we see that instead of worrying about changes in Eastern Europe, Gorbachev and his new thinkers were increasingly worried about the perspective of a violent collapse of the Soviet Union itself. Chernyaev wrote on October 11, 1989, that's just weeks before the fall of the Berlin Wall. He commented on his diary about the Azeri-Armenian conflict. The civil war in the country has already begun. Against this context, the explosion of national separatism, peaceful though, in Lithuania was viewed also as a possible fuse to violence. At the discussion of the Politburo, a few people commented, both conservatives and non-conservatives, if we get along with the demands of Lithuanians, the entire Russia would erupt. So those expectations played a role in not only non-involvement and non-interference into Eastern European affairs, but I would say Eastern European events that remained in the focus of the West at that time were in the periphery of Gorbachev's vision in 1989. So, of course, time is out. I have no time to comment on Gorbachev's personality, but I must, actually. Just a few lines, those of you who... some of you who read what I wrote about Gorbachev know I was a little bit critical of him, his ad hocism, his remarkable lack of strategizing, his, go as it gets, sort of Napoleonic, on s'engage and puis on voit, all those things. But at the end of all of this, I admit, and I should acknowledge that Gorbachev faced absolutely stunningly difficult situation. And instead of criticizing Gorbachev for not doing this, not doing that, I would simply say that two things. Gorbachev was not a Moses. Although the scale of his project was on Moses' scope. He released Russian society. He released Soviet society off its moorings, but he refused to guide them, even across the desert, not to mention for 40 years. The second thing I would like to comment on Gorbachev, at some point in November 1990, a remarkable conversation took place between George Kennan and Alexander Yakovlev, and I thank Svetlana Savranskaya for actually providing me this document yesterday. And it was quite appropriate for this talk when Kennan said, I believe in Russian society. I believe in Russians who always found spiritual forces for regeneration and revival. When we sometimes look in desperation on Russia and various situations in Russia, we also should remember that Gorbachev was Russian, Yakovlev was Russian, and Russia did produce, and I hope will produce, remarkable people who, despite all odds, move the country forward to democracy.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Professor Zubak. We'll now move on to Tom Gallagher from the University of Bradford.
Thank you very much, Charles. Thanks are due to the Wilson Centre for hosting this event today, and especially for the Romanian Cultural Institute. Is the microphone switched on?
Yeah, just press the little button at the bottom, see if that...
Yeah. Is that better? Well, I'm going to have to shout, but that's not permissible.
Yeah, here, we can just move this. We just move this one down for now.
Yeah, take mine.
All right, thank you. So, yes, thanks are due to the Romanian Cultural Institute, which is, I think, a beacon of enlightenment in a currently very flat and even somber cultural landscape in Romania. Thanks are due also to Bogdan Jakob for, being extremely efficient and painstaking during the long period of preparation for this event. I mean, I agree that 1989 was a game-changing year, and in Romania, without the popular uprising, first in Timișoara and then in Bucharest, the amount of change that has materialized perhaps would not have occurred, at least during the time scale it did. But the word speculative appears in my paper, and unfortunately, speculators, value-free individuals with roots in the old system, primarily, have been very successful in testing the limits of the plural and economic communities that Romania has joined, and has found those limits surprisingly flexible. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is look at the main political cleavages in Romania between those determined to shape the country around rules and values which benefit a restricted set of players, and those still committed, many of whom are here in this room, to the arduous task of building institutions and establishing norms which make the state legitimate in the eyes of a majority of citizens. So 20 years on from 1989, we've had a decade of modernisation reform supposedly carried out under the auspices of the European Union, but a primitive warfare for positions often appears to be the only recognisable form of activity on a barren political landscape. Much of the economy is privatised, but control is exercised by interlocking economic and political groups, often given the term oligarchy. Within society and even among educated people located in the liberal professions, a sense of abandonment and isolation is palpable. Forces which were seen as instruments of modernisation and political renewal, civil society, the university world, the media, have fallen far short of their potential, or else have been colonised by this oligarchy. President Traian Băsescu has taken a few steps to block the further entrenchment of the oligarchy in politics and the economy. He's been opposed by trans-party interests that have dominated Parliament since the elections of 2004. Even if he's re-elected on the 6th of December, his prospects appear uncertain given the strength of his opponents. Arguably, the only truly successful politician Romania has produced in the last 20 years is Ion Iliescu. He will celebrate his 80th birthday 1 month after the 20th anniversary celebrations of the ambiguous and still contested set of events known as the Romanian Revolution, which brought him to prominence. He is the architect of the political system, the creator of its rules, the definer of its goals, which functions today, and whose demise does not appear to be imminent. It was a hybrid and adaptable one with outwardly democratic features, but which was designed in such a way as to foil any change that threatened the hold on power of the new elite sponsored by him. He still remains a key voice in the Social Democratic Party, the lineal successor of the Communist Party. It has adapted itself to situations that appeared to pose a mortal threat to its survival, as well as opposition, privatisation of huge swathes of the state, entry into NATO, engagement with the European Union. Probably this party's greatest achievement was draining the process of Europeanisation of nearly all progressive content and forcing the EU to accept Romania as a full member 2 years ago on an extremely limited agenda of change. The 1989 revolt has been history-changing, but it failed to act as a foundation event offering legitimacy for the new post-authoritarian political system. There was extensive loss of life, but the failure of very few to answer before a court of law for the role of the events between 16 and 25 December, which of course culminated in the hurried execution of Ceausescu's. For an understanding of some of the roots of the current malaise, it's necessary to dig deeper into the roots of the communist past. Millions of Romanians became used to relations of dependency with the state and its representatives. A system of personal dictatorship was kept in place by a clique of corrupt sycophants who had deprived the party of any real decision-making. They were equated with the entire Communist Party, and when they were detained, the dictatorship ended, their successors proclaimed that communism itself had been terminated. What were the objectives of those who played the determining role then in the events of 1989? Well, there were about 7. To decisively curtail the power of Ceausescu, foil any attempt by loyalists to cling to power, prevent popular unrest, demobilise those forces which had taken to the streets, re-establish authority in new conditions. Second-ranking party-state functionaries were utilised in order to carry out a range of tasks that would enable new ruling groups to fill the political vacuum, overwhelm rivals who had different ideas for the future. Revamp forces of control under new guises. This meant a prominent role for the intelligence services, even though they had been the most influential and feared part of Ceausescu's armoury. Establish a grip over the domestic media, no longer under strict totalitarian control. Prevent forces inspired by Western democratic models from acquiring a foothold in key non-political institutions. And I'll pause here because I think this is often overlooked. moves were made to prevent institutions lacking a political function becoming a stronghold for ideas and practices at variance with those of Iliescu. The Romanian Academy was hastily reconstituted. Intellectuals who had opposed Ceausescu and were prominent in post-1989 efforts to democratize the country were excluded. 20 years later, with its membership still drawn heavily from figures reliant on patronage from an unreformed state, the Romanian Academy in September hosted an event called X-Ray of a Miracle, the Fall of Communism in Europe. Who was the keynote speaker? Of course, Ion Iliescu. Strategically, the necessity of ensuring that higher education did not become a rival pole of legitimacy, undermining the authority of the post-communist regime, was even more important. Pseudo-universities were set up by pre-1989 functionaries. The Spiro Haret University by 2009 had become a huge economic empire, awarding hundreds of thousands of degrees annually, in the process severely compromising the reputation of Romanian higher education. Another important set of institutions whose modernisation was vital if Romania was to build a transparent and free enterprise system were the banking sector. A succession of private banks were formed which misappropriated their customers' investments. Few fraudulent bank chiefs faced prison, even if condemned by courts of law. Then there were managed changes in the countryside to suit the interests of those in control of the collectivised system. Most Romanians still lived in the countryside, despite the frantic industrialisation which had occurred from the late 50s onwards. And Iliescu personally intervened to limit the amount of land that could be restored to former peasant owners, making commercial farming unviable. By 1990, it was already starting to become clear that the primary goal of the new regime was to rule out any normalisation of conditions along recognisably Western pluralist lines and disable or deform those institutions capable, if left to themselves, of enabling Romania to recover from the profound malformations of the communist era. Members of the party and state apparatus, who may have feared for their positions or even liberty if the demands of the Timișoara movement had won strong nationwide support, grew in confidence as the National Salvation Front, Iliescu's vehicle, filled the state vacuum in 1990. Much of the population was comfortable with paternalistic rule, in which they were granted a few of the material improvements that had already occurred in countries like Hungary, Poland. Political awareness would rapidly increase, but the decades ahead revealed just how vulnerable big swathes of the population were to various forms of manipulation, ranging from the ultranationalism promoted in the Ceausescu era to financial scams like the Caritas affair, to the crude manipulation of present-day television channels owned by moguls whose programmes often seem designed to keep much of the population in a semi-vegetative state. The men of the old structures, seeking to prolong their influence in new times, were also encouraged by the low-key and reactive response of international institutions and major Western states. Only when Iliescu summoned an army of coal miners to Bucharest in June 1990 to drive opposition forces from the streets did forceful reactions emanate from the United States and the European Union. The huge scale of the 1990 electoral victory for the FSNE removed inhibitions about restoring figures from the past to positions of authority. A 5-year period ensued of collaboration with the ultranationalist ideologue Vadim Tudor, ruling formations intent on converting political strength into economic power needed noisy populists able to divert attention away from the plunder of state assets. An introspective opposition, which only put aside factional rivalries after 1992, lacked the energy or awareness to see the degree to which some of the most retrograde forces in the Ceausescu era were enjoying a comeback. Members of the pre-1989 apparatus enjoyed generous pensions, access to a network of hospitals, rest homes. This was in contrast to the bulk of the elderly, whose meagre pensions failed to shield them from runaway inflation. The privileged position enjoyed even by some of the most feared members of the Ceausescu's secret police was shown at the funeral in September of Dumitru Pleshita, the unrepentant torturer spent his final days in a hospital of the Domestic Intelligence Service, even though it was supposed to have had no connection with its dictatorial predecessor. It's hard to argue that Romania has witnessed genuine decommunisation when such scenes have occurred near the 20th anniversary of the 1989 events. Care was taken that Parliament would not assume a representative function on behalf of the 22 million citizens, but instead would be a forum where members of the new elite bargain for preferment with the head of state arbitrating between them. Parties were and are composed of factions, many of whose members changed sides unmindful of ideologies or programmes. They only showed discipline when there appeared a risk to the privileges that they enjoyed before the law. Iliescu and his allies came to terms with the end of a single-party communism, state-controlled economy, by creating weak, deliberately weak, political, administrative and economic institutions which provided a source of cover, a source of wealth and influence for the power networks which grew up. They retained control of a fluid situation by ensuring that change of any significance could only arise through obeying the vast amount of procedures and laws that perhaps have always shaped the way that the bureaucratic world operates in Romania. As it seemed that there might be a place after all for Romania in the new Euro-Atlantic economic and security institutions moving eastwards, there was growing Western pressure to speed up change. But the post-communists knew that to survive, they must defeat and discredit such welcome intrusions into the Byzantine world of rituals and procedures that continue to animate the Romanian state. Thanks to intimidated or more usually compliant judges and civil servants, they would retain control of the laws and regulations and decide how they were interpreted. By 1996, hard economic decisions had to be taken due to the profligacy of recent years that had witnessed the rise of a rent-seeking elite. The arrival of a pro-Western government could restart the foreign loans and aid which had been withheld from the Vacaroiu government due to their misuse. The risk of an economic and financial collapse along the lines that had occurred in Bulgaria due to some similar abuses could be reduced. It might even be a delicious bonus if pragmatic elements in the opposition put aside their ideas for cleaning up politics, allowing the institutionalisation of the political system masterminded by Iliescu. This process of normalisation, in which the sharp ideological dividing lines of the early 90s began to recede, occurred during the presidency of Emil Constantinescu. He always retreated from challenging hidden power structures in the economy and the Secret Service. Gradually, the idea that politics essentially revolved around transferring state assets into private hands and building up a network of patron-client relations began to extend beyond Iliescu's party. How much this vision of politics animated the PSD's opponents would be made clear after 2004 under Călin Popescu-Tariceanu, leader of the Liberals, Prime Minister of a heterogeneous coalition government. Adrian Nastase, his predecessor as Prime Minister, had allowed opposition figures prepared to abide by the PSD's rules to play a prominent role in the privatisation process. The success of extending the range of privileges beyond the PSD and its clients was shown in 2007 when the Hungarian minority party, the RMDSU-DMR, fully aligned with the oligarchy. Democracy advocates from outside Romania had hoped that the post-communist system would acquire legitimacy by acquiring rules and institutions broadly respected by political forces. But instead it was the distribution of state assets among political players, key economic allies, retinue of clients. It was this which promoted the consensual behaviour among warring forces. A gulf simultaneously opened up between the state and the millions in society who failed to benefit from this cronyism. But as in Ceausescu's times, there was a conviction among power holders that the alienation of the losers could be contained by manipulating society, and here the media was and is the key tool. The emigration of 1/10 of the adult labour force to work mainly in different parts of the EU also provided an important safety valve. No time to talk about the justice system. Let's move on finally to the EU. Romania's various elites have been single-minded in adapting change to suit their private political and economic interests. Supposedly a peripheral and even backward country was being transformed as the EU gradually projected its norms and values eastwards after 2000. The exercise of soft power has been theorised as a process of Europeanisation at work. But the EU's engagement with Romania turned out to be low-grade and uninspired. Serious design flaws have been exposed in the EU's efforts to establish an arena coinciding with the recognised borders of Europe where values of economic and political pluralism would be dominant. Instead, new forms of political authoritarianism, combined with manipulation of the media, advancing criminality deep into the heart of the economy, have occurred. The EU's humanising and moral vision, in which an ex-communist state like Romania would see the rise of an engaged citizenry emboldened by the reform of political institutions, now lies in tatters. Romanians found themselves increasingly spectators after 2000, with no way of influencing events. Striking inequalities between the political class and the rest of society intensified thanks to economic liberalisation sponsored by the EU. A lean, competitive economy was required in order to attract investment, enable Romania one day to be a success inside the EU. So was a faster pace of political liberalisation and institutional reform, things given equivalent weight in the EU's blueprint for Eastern enlargement. But during the 7 years of negotiations, it was the economic conditions, not the political ones, which Brussels was most interested in Bucharest complying with. This is something I've argued in a book, Romania and the EU, How the Weak Conquered the Strong, which was published 2 months ago. Sorry for the plug. The EU forgot that the post-communist ruling elite had already been busy for years transferring state assets into private hands in numerous ways. So Romania joined in 2007 with only promises of reform to come. The elite played an excellent role-playing strategy. It went through the motions of change, ministries restructured, action plans, targets launched and relaunched. This enabled EU officials to say in the reports, yes, change is on its way. And top officials in Bucharest, they noticed that when the deadlines for implementing change drew near, the EU was always prepared to relax its conditions. The Commission feared declaring failure, admitting we've messed up here, because it would only have drawn its attention to its own lack of professionalism. So to sum up, as I say, the main cleavage is now between those, the rent-seeking elite, and those who are in a minority committed to genuinely moving Romania in a Western trajectory. The initiative lies with those lacking any wider obligations beyond their own enrichment, more than at any time since 1990. An unprincipled system built initially on terror and hypocrisy and later corruption has proven more enduring and resilient in Romania than perhaps anywhere else in Eastern Europe. And the population today, psychologically, is in a diminished state. It's increasingly sad occasion when I have to visit Romania, fragmented, distrustful, unable to articulate or agree on a set of public values that will enable it even to shape a small part of the national destiny. It's hard to see any quick prospect of Romania moving in a direction of genuine European-inspired reform, and instead it's a form of pseudo-Europeanisation, drawing on some of the worst elements of Balkan political culture, which shows every sign of prevailing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gallagher. We'll now move on to Thomas Blanton from George Washington University on civil society and 1989 in East Europe.
I think this one is working. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Charles, very much. These are fascinating contributions, and it's been an amazing day yesterday and today, although I have to say that being assigned by Vladimir Tizminiano to discuss civil society and myths and illusions and disenchantments after 1989 is sort of like being in the crowd at the World Cup and having Ronaldo point to you in the stands and say, "Come down here and take my cleats and play a little bit." So given the bibliography just that Vlad has published on civil society and those issues over the years, the biggest challenge I really face today is simply not stumbling over his shoelaces. And so, to me, the striking elements of the 20th anniversaries of 1989 are the ways in which the civil society narratives, which Tismanianu, Rupnik, Garton-Ash, and others have contributed so much to, how they've been really under challenge, particularly yesterday. Particularly, I'd say, in the last month or so. And I'm going to remark today on 3 or 4 of those kinds of challenges. And I'm particularly going to pay attention to some of the American-generated narratives or mythic narratives that have been proposed to sort of take the place or crowd out the civil society narrative. But I want to start just with a quote from the American Declaration of Independence when they talk about holding certain truths to be self-evident. And I think if you went back and in the wake of 1989, we would have said it's self-evident that the core organizing principles that drove this extraordinary change came out of civil society, came out of dissidents. The evidence of your own eyes of the Civic Forum working in the basement of the Magic Lantern Theater, the way in which core ideas about means and ends, about Micknick's great phrase, those who attack Bastilles go on to build their own Bastilles, the necessities of nonviolence, the notions of creating parallel polis, the Václav Binda's notion, the commitments to nonviolence as that's not the way to go, the separation of spaces, challenging communism not by confronting but by creating one's own space, and even defending the kind of self-expression that many of these thinkers were quite personally uncomfortable with. Take the plastic people of the universe. It took some real diplomacy to even bring Havel and others to witness those folks' trial. They were not immediately lovable, huggable guys, those plastics. Quite difficult people, iconoclasts and radicals of self-expression. And so I'm struck by the many ways in which understanding those events at the time and understanding the roles of civil society and these core ideas were crucial to even being able to explain the acceleration of history in 1989. There's the late geologist, paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould had a notion of history which he said it's not, Darwinian evolution is not a progression in this way. It's actually something more like punctuated equilibriums. The equilibriums trundle along, then all of a sudden acute events occur, whether a meteor in the Yucatan sets up clouds that wipe out the dinosaurs. But 1989 was one of those kinds of events, a conjunction of ideas that found some resonance in Moscow, as Vlad Zubak has pointed out, that then came together as a way to change, but then perhaps the equilibrium, as Tom Gallagher has suggested in Romania, is kind of settled back in its own way, but taken over by some new dinosaurs, predatory privatization, new elites and oligarchs. But what's fascinating to me is that if you take the notion of, I think, Miroslav Kusi, this Slovak dissident who was one of the signers, one of the few Slovak signers of Charter 77, who described these kinds of ideas bubbling under communism as islands of positive deviation. Islands of positive deviation. And the metaphor he used and why that made a difference in 1989 was that these serve the role as chemicals sort of dropped at the right moment into the beaker so that it would bubble up, so that it would explode, so a chemical reaction would take place. And if these kinds of notions of civil society and dissidents were chemical reactions, then the example of solidarity in Poland can only be metaphorically described as nuclear fusion. If 1,000 signers of the Charter were a chemical reaction in Czechoslovakia, 10 million Solidarity members in Poland were a nuclear reaction. And that is, I think, the key counter. We were discussing yesterday at this conference the new book by Stephen Kotkin, which Professor Tismignano says, he's going to be teaching in his courses. It's brilliant, even though he really disagrees with it. And this is a wonderful grappling. But to me, the answers to the Kotkin thesis of the suicides of the elites, I think, can be found both in the clear role of civil society notions and dissidents in 1989, and also in evidence like that in our new book, Masterpieces of History. Vlad Zubak started this process. Svetlana Savranska really finished it. In the middle, there I was holding up the works by bringing a focus on the American side, and that's not really where the action was. And I think that's one of the constructive narratives that I'm going to speak to in just a minute. Svetlana's essay in this book is called The Logic of 1989, because it's the way in which new ideas from Moscow created their own dynamics, found a reflexive process in Eastern Europe, accelerated by the role of the media, whether it's Radio Free Europe and the BBC, which provided this fundamental communication role that really helped accelerate history, or that wonderful example I think that my colleague spoke of yesterday, where the television stations announced the fall of the Berlin Wall before it actually fell. And then people came down to the border and said, it's open, it's open. The guard said, no, it's not. But they made it so. And this extraordinary sort of interactive process, to me, is one of the great dynamics of 1989 and one of the tributes to all these notions of autonomy and constructed space in opposition. But the question then is, how do these ideas of these moral ideas, these ethical ideas, these ideas about organizing society come to the point of disillusion and disenchantment? And I think Agnes Heller really gave us the answer yesterday when she said, look, there was one no, which is the no to the system, the no to communism, but there were many, 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 many yeses. There was even a yes from Iliescu in his own strange way. He was going to replace those guys with his own system. It's not as authoritarian, not as draconian as Ceausescu's, but there were many yeses, and there was room in 1989 for many yeses, and maybe that's the problem with trying to hold us to that standard of thinking afterwards when normality ensues. Not normalization in the Czech sense, because that was really a new form of Stalinism, but normality, and maybe that's the best we can wish for. But what strikes me about particularly these anniversary events is the ways in which other narratives are being pushed forward, and I think this is my key point today, the construction of alternative narratives. I think Jacques Rupnik once wrote about the dissidents of Charter 77 that before 1989, they were described by the authorities as kind of an intellectual ghetto all by themselves, not really having much interaction with reality or society. When 1989 occurred, the metaphor changed from ghetto to tip of the iceberg, because they represented something much larger than themselves. They represented a large, inexorable force on which the Titanic of the communist system crashed and sank. But then after 1989, when civil society notions did not provide the organizing principles for so many of the new politics, they went sort of back to the ghetto, or rather I should say, were pushed back to the ghetto. And one of the people who pushed them back to the ghetto was here in Washington last week, and I was really struck by his adoption of some of the American-generated myths and narratives of 1989. And this is the Czech President Václav Klaus. And to a packed crowd at the Czech embassy last Wednesday night, he basically managed never to mention Czechoslovakia's own tradition of dissidence, the phenomenal ideas that came out of civil society there. Rather, and maybe this was just an expression of diplomatic nicety, but I actually believe it reflects something quite deeper. He said, the total credit should go to Ronald Reagan. This is fascinating to me because this really is a constructed myth in American politics. The Reagan role. It's the It's the discourse of the neoconservatives that force and pressure change the world, that somehow Reagan's both rhetoric, military buildup, and all this had the essential impact on the Soviet Union that forced its collapse. And there are enormous disjunctures in here. We have some of the evidence here. We've published other documents on the web that suggest that actually Ronald Reagan did have a major role in the events of 1989, but they were not from his pressure or from his rhetoric, but rather from his interaction with Gorbachev, which had this wonderful effect of relieving Gorbachev's own sense of threat. I mean, it's after the Geneva summit in 1985 that Gorbachev's advisor Chernyayev writes in his diary they're talking about nuclear weapons, and this is January 1986, and Chernyayev writes, well, now Gorbachev realizes that even if we disarmed tomorrow, the Americans would not attack. Even if we disarmed tomorrow, the Americans would not attack. It's fascinating because at Geneva, Reagan had given a dinner toast. It was a wonderful moment. It's in the transcript we've published on the web that Svetlana and I edited a briefing book of. And Reagan stands up at dinner at Geneva and toasts Gorbachev, and he says, you know, we really do have commonality. Just think if an alien life form was approaching the Earth on Halley's Comet, threatening human civilization, you and I, we would band together and we would defend humanity against this evil. And by the way, those aliens are among us. They're nuclear weapons. This Reagan's nuclear abolitionism had a fascinating, I think, interaction. Vlad and others have written about Gorbachev's nuclear thinking, but Reagan doesn't get much credit for this. This was Reagan's great contribution, the relief of the sense of threat. If the Americans won't attack, even if you're disarmed, then what's your excuse for a repressive system? What's your need for a buffer zone in Eastern Europe, a security belt? If the threat isn't really there anymore, that changes things dramatically, and it has a role. What's fascinating to me is that at the Party Congress in February 1986, Gorbachev directly quotes Reagan's dinner toast. He says, oh, the American president, he talked about aliens arriving. Well, we have bigger threats, environmental degradation, and, of course, nuclear weapons. And this is the speech, February 1986, which arguably was more important for the end of the Cold War than Reagan's speech at the Berlin Wall, tear down this wall, because this was the speech in 86 in which Gorbachev renounces class struggle as a basis for international relations and talks about the Eastern Europe's ability to do it on their own, and the Soviet Union is going to proceed in a different way. New thinking. This was the first great expression. So let's give some credit to Ronald Reagan. It's just not the credit that comes from this sort of mythic narrative of pressure and evil empire. One of the great things about Jack Matlock's book, Reagan and Gorbachev, is he has about 50 quotes at the beginning of it where Reagan is calling for abolition of nuclear weapons, talks with the Soviet Union. And then he notices that Matlock makes a point of comparing those to the one time that Reagan used the evil empire label. But the evil empire label is the only one that anyone remembers. And this is a constructed narrative. There are many other examples of how this interaction works and sort of missed opportunities, but that's beyond our ambit today. Let me just talk about the constructed narrative from yesterday at the Bush Library at Texas A&M at College Station. And the constructed narrative there, again, that replaces what we know about 89, that fills in that space and says, no, it wasn't civil society, it wasn't dissidents, it wasn't even really Gorbachev. At the Bush Library, the discourse was about the Bush administration's grand strategy for Europe and how this ultimately came about in a unified Germany, and they point to Bush's series of speeches in the spring of 1989 in which he, among other things, announced the call for Europe whole and free. Now, these are fabulous words, and they are a leap for the American president in his way, but the backstory of how that phrase even was inserted into the speech undercuts the force of it, because it was Brent Scowcroft's idea to replace language that was originally in the speech calling for German unification. Oh, that's premature, Scowcroft writes. That would be leading to instability. We don't want to go there. So we'll do whole and free, but nothing to back it up. Very small offerings of aid to Solidarity at the very moment that Solidarity is running in those elections in June 1989, arguing that we're the ones who can bring in Western aid, but there's no Western aid to offer. to read Bush's diary and Bush's memoirs and the back and forth, particularly around Bush's trip to Eastern Europe in the summer of 1989, is to perceive an American administration that's fundamentally incredibly insecure, behind the curve, worried about Gorbachev, worried about his leadership, his initiative, never seeming to ask the question, wow, if he's announcing all these unilateral arms reductions and initiatives, couldn't that be in our national security interest? Isn't that good for us? Isn't this something that we would want? Instead, it's about leadership. And by the time Bush actually hears from Jaruzelski and the Hungarian Reform Communists that he ought to go meet with Gorbachev, his traumatic experience in that trip to Eastern Europe was with the dissidents. He was really uncomfortable, particularly with the Hungarians. They write in their diary, Bush and Scowcroft, gosh, these scruffy guys are not ready to, run anything over here. And then he writes to Gorbachev, and Bush says to himself, things are getting out of control. Events are moving too fast. We need to intervene and slow it down. So in contrast to a grand strategy of American principles and American design for the events of 1989, you see an actual policy that's more about slowing it down. And so this constructive narrative, I think, is part of the American political sphere, but it's being picked up by leaders and speakers around the world. And I think in that sense it's wrong, but there is room for it. And this is Garton Ash's great phrase that Bush did exactly the right thing by doing nothing. Which is to say, is actually his lack of impact, his pause. I argue this more at length in my essay in Masterpieces of History, that this vacuum between the superpowers actually created space for the East Europeans to rush in and make their own revolutions with civil society ideas, with dissidents, with mass organizations, with reform communists, with resonance from Moscow. It's an amazing story, and there's room in this story for many narratives. I was struck last week, and I'm down to my last couple of points, struck last week by the historian Bernd Schaefer, who emphasizes the extraordinary action of the East German refugees, voting with their feet, creating a refugee crisis that first with pressure on Hungary, then pressure on Czechoslovakia. By the night of November 8th, 1989, you even had the hardline Czech communists doing a démarche to East Berlin saying, open the wall. We're not going to be your border guards anymore. We're not going to clean up your mess. You need to let those refugees go directly to the West. When even the Czech communists, GDR's last friends in the bloc, are calling for the end of the wall, events are in the saddle and riding mankind. But I think this is a narrative, the selfish actions of individuals, even leaving their families behind, rushing to the West, and bringing this extraordinary pressure that ultimately has an impact on turning even hardliners into advocates for change. I think this is the kind of narrative that Václav Klaus would really appreciate. He's into the Adam Smithian notions of individuals acting for selfish reasons, turns up with a greater good. And at the 15th anniversary of 1989, it was Klaus's direct point where he said, it wasn't actually the dissidents. At that time, he didn't call on Ronald Reagan either. He said it was the actions of the individuals who did nothing. In other words, the people who, the old joke, you pretend to work, we'll pretend to pay you, or in I think the Czech case, short working hours, long drinking hours. The greengrocers, the people who just opted out, who didn't make the system work. And these are Klaus's sort of selfish heroes, the ones who didn't take action, who didn't join those civil society notions. This is a constructed narrative, but I think just as there's room for some of Stephen Kotkin's notions, there's room for some of Klaus's notions, there's room for this selfishness, but all this room for all these narratives should not force out, push away, put back in the ghetto these formative concepts, I think, of civil society, dissidents, meaning in life that remain as a kind of a long-term critique. So I'll end with a Klaus joke, which is actually a modified version of you can use it for whatever leader you would like, but the joke goes something like this: Obama, Medvedev, and Klaus are called in by God. God says, "Guys, world is going to end in 2 weeks. Inform your people." Obama comes back, goes on national television, says, good news and bad news. Good news, I've opened up a dialogue with God, and so we're working on it. Bad news? He says the world's going to end in 2 weeks. Medvedev goes back to Russia, goes on national television, says, people of Russia, I have 2 pieces of terrible news for you. First, Russia's going to be destroyed in 2 weeks. Second, Putin is not God. Klaus goes back to the Czech Republic, goes on national television, says, people of the Czech Republic, I have 2 pieces of good news for you. First, I will be your president for life. Second, the European Union will be destroyed in 2 weeks. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Finally, our last speaker is Konrad Jarausch from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
I guess this mic is working. I'm also pleased to be back here at the Wilson Center because when I was here originally, it was the year that Vlad Georgescu was here, and I met him, and we talked, and some of my interest in Romania comes from there. But I want to talk about the German perspective today and abbreviate my comments in the form of the essay that I wrote for the SSRC website on public forum, because the German issue is kind of, other than the Soviet Union, the gorilla in the room that is not being talked about very much, because the fall of the wall, after all, happened in Berlin. That's too bad for Eastern Europe. And, it's a kind of a symbolic event that is connected, of course, to all of the things that go on in Eastern Europe, because East Germany was part of the bloc. But then there is, as always, a German-German difference in the story. And I want to reflect on that for a moment. As the most important European event since 1945, the overthrow of communism during 89-91 poses a double challenge for retrospective understanding. Because the current wave of commemorations at the 20th anniversary of the fall of the wall is largely promoting an anti-communist agenda, the democratic awakening needs to be rescued from such instrumentalization by contemporary memory politics. And we just heard a presentation that tries to rescue some of it from American memory politics. Okay, so as historians and academics, that's what we ought to be doing, rather than acting within memory politics in order to promote a certain version of it. The second point that I want to make is that the outpouring of commemorations that have even made it to the American Airlines flight magazine, advising you to fly to Berlin, although they don't have a direct flight, you should go there anyway, and then they tell you what you should all see, is full of narratives. It's full of dramatizations of moments. And that's very nice and heartwarming. I mean, I like many of the stories that are being told, but they don't really help us understand much. And I want to, therefore, in spite of all of the good work of our conference organizer and various other colleagues in this room, say we have an interpretive deficit. 89 gets talked about a lot, but it does not really or it has not really produced new interpretations. It has produced new myths in the commemorations, but no real new understanding. And what I want to do is sort of map some of the problems that we need to solve in order to get to this new understanding, and do so in 3 steps, namely in talking about problems of causes, then talk about problems of processes, and also talk a little bit about problems of consequences, because we've had all 3 of these arenas in our debates without sort of clarifying them and really focusing on them. Let me start with the issue of causes. Historians, of course, have habits of dealing with causes that have to do with sort of their seat-of-the-pants feeling about how you should explain something. And the first thing that they do is talk about long-range structural preconditions, something like that. And then we can have, of course, a list of these. And the list is ideologically determined. I mean, whether you talk with the economy falling behind and the need for Gorbachev's reform, whether you talk about the new Cold War, the arms race and arming the East to death, or you sort of say it's more détente. I mean, I happen to agree with the softer version more than with the harder version, because I can't think of the repeal of the Brezhnev Doctrine at a time when tensions are at their height. This just doesn't make any sense at all. Or, you talk about the revival of civil society, and, this is, of course, something that I've also talked about in the German context. It's a notion that comes from East Central Europe, And I think the thing that, finally gets least coverage, but, Professor Zubock talked about it some, is the role of the communists in this, the crumbling or the erosion of belief. So what you've got is a set of long-range processes that are operating and that are commented upon, and these processes were not really surprising. I mean, that's where the commentary was okay of the academics. But what they didn't do very well is the next level, because what you also need to get from structural problems to an acute crisis, you need sets of events. You need a particular concatenation of specifics to transform, underlying problems into something that actually becomes action for people. And that, of course, starts with Solidarność and the Polish issue. It goes on to the liberalization of the Hungarian leadership, which gets to the opening of the Iron Curtain and to the mass flight. But it also deals with the rapid growth of public protests in Leipzig and Prague and so on that could no longer be suppressed by force. And then, of course, you get into the problems that communist parties have in dealing with all of this, because they are confronted with the choice. Will they go with Gorbachev and learn from Russia, from Russland lernen heißt Siegen lernen, von der Sowjetunion lernen heißt Siegen lernen, will they learn how to win with the Russians and reform, or will they hang on to their, post-Stalinist version, of communism? Now, it's these events, these events that make structure into something that actually happens in the summer and fall and winter of 1989-90. But on top of it, I think I would want to take from the social scientists the concept that analyzes mobilization, because you also have to explain how, discontent gets from courageous dissidents, the role of which I would also want to underline, but it has to become a mass phenomenon in order to become historically important and operative and so on. And that's what I would think is a process of contagion, if you want to think in terms of the swine flu for a moment. That is, how does it get from one person to the next? And that, of course, does start with the dissidents themselves and their critique. And I think the human rights issue is important at the moment, at the point when dissidents are being persecuted. Then they figure out that they have to have human rights, and it's not necessarily important for the whole population. But then I think the Western media are very, very important. In the German case, of course, it's television and radio, but we heard about Radio for Europe last night, I think very effectively, and so on. And then another element of this is actually the demonstration experience, because how do you lose fear? Not by listening to radio or by seeing, some foolhardy dissident, with a placard and a beard and so on being beaten, by some security force, but only when you have participated in a demonstration and you see that it grows and you have thousands of people walking with you and so on, then you are at a moment when you kind of, give up your own dual thinking of sort of private doubt and public conformity, and how do you get, from one to the other. And finally, of course, when this all grows, you throw communist parties into fundamental confusion, whether to use the Chinese response or whether to find some way of accommodating to this mounting challenge. One of the most interesting things to me is the absence of the word counter-revolution in the fall of 1989. Why don't they talk about it? I mean, classic communism, they should talk about counter-revolution and so on, but somehow they have a sense that, we are the people, that slogan, is one that takes sort of moral, justification, legitimacy away from them, and that the people themselves are speaking to those people who are actually claiming to be speaking for the people. That's a tremendous role reversal, that we need to explain. So it seems to me we have a challenge of causes that has to do with structural underlying developments, that has to do with how events play into those, and it has to do with acceleration and mobilization. And I think, that is sort of one bunch of things that is out there, as a set of, intellectual things that we have to cope with and have to do. The second part that I want to talk about is the question of processes, and here the central issue is collapse or revolution. Is it a collapse? Is communism just moribund, or a suicide of elites, or whatever you want to do, which is a kind of a Washingtonian perspective in some way, because it's a top-down government perspective and so on. When East European governments don't function anymore, parties don't function anymore, and so on. Or is it something that comes from below? My personal view, of course, is that communism doesn't just crumble from above, but it was overthrown by mass pressure from below. And of course, it's an interactive process to some degree, because if sort of the communists are still tough and confident, then they do Tiananmen Square, and if they are doubtful and confused and so on, then, they don't know how to respond to the pressure from below. The first step, of course, is the recovery of human rights in this process. It's a set of contestations. If you do sort of, the McAdam, Tilley and Tarot and so on thing and so on. But then you've got to explain what kind of contestation is it? Why, or Timothy Garton Ash, civil unrest and so on. Okay, it's a classic process of mounting civil unrest. But then you get to a crucial point, which is the transition of reform to revolution. How does it get from one to the other? Because it starts recovering public space with a rhetoric of reform. And that rhetoric of reform is, of course, pushed by the dissidents, okay? But then the space that is recovered by the rhetoric of reform often gets filled by people who are colloquially known as the silent majority, that is, by ordinary citizens who may have different views from the dissidents. And in the German case, of course, the dissidents are still constructing a better socialism. But the majority of the people want a fundamental system change. They want to get rid of communism altogether. And this is a crucial analytical distinction. And it is visible in the different slogans, what you do. Whether you call for civil rights, whether you call for reform of specific policies, or whether you call for, the abolition of communism altogether. And in the German case, this happened sometime in November, this transition from the former to the latter. Now, from the classic tradition of revolution, 89 departs through nonviolence. This is, I think, my argument about a new form. And this is, again, also crucial because there's a Revolutionary War with the Americans, okay? There is the Jacobins in the French Revolution. There is Bolshevik terror and civil war and so on. And, this is the astounding thing of 89 is really this non-violence. And, of course, it has to do with other post-dictatorial transitions. There is some, learning, from the Mediterranean and from Latin America there and so on. And it has to do with tremendous restraints on both sides. The security forces who are no longer quite sure of what they're doing, and, of course, the protesters that come out of a peace movement themselves and come, in the German case, out of the Protestant churches and so on. And therefore, they're calling for nonviolence. But the astounding thing to me is that, except for in Romania, that there is no violence, because my fear was always during the events that somebody would get drunk and use force, and then a local Stasi commander, would then use force, and the crowd would respond, and then they would call in the local Russian Red Army commander who would not pay any attention to Gorbachev and would march, and so on. And it's a dog that didn't bark, that needs explaining. This is an interpretive challenge for us. Why nonviolence? And finally, of course, in the process, there is also the issue of nationalism. And it's crucial in the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It's also crucial in the dissolution of two Versailles states, namely Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, and so on. These are inventions of Paris peace conferences and so on. And what you then get back really is the map of Brest-Litovsk in East Central Europe. I know you're not supposed to talk about this because it's an ugly German-dominated piece. In 1989-90, the Germans are weak and the Russians are weak, ultimately. And so East Central Europe reemerges in all of its multiplicity and so on. But I think it is something that needs to be talked about and reflected historically. And of course, in the German case, there is a problem in interpretation because the Germans talk about unification most of all, but my thesis is that unification is the form of transformation in the German case. Okay? It is still linked to what I would call a new kind of revolution because it's the quickest way to get to market economy and democratic institutions and cultural pluralism and multiplicity in society where you have many civil society elements. Okay, let me just talk for one more minute about the results, because proof of this as a revolutionary upheaval, in my mind, is the drastic nature of the results. Because if there aren't any results, then you don't have much of a revolution. But it's clear. You have parliamentary government, you have a market economy, you have civil society, and you have cultural pluralism. I mean, geez, if these are not major league transformations, then what? And of course, you have enormous international repercussions with the end of the Cold War, the departure of the Russian troops out of Central Europe, German unification, the end of some of the untidy stuff of the Second World War still with the border settlements and so on. And of course, in some cases, the national dimension creates new ethnic strife, as in the Balkan countries, and some xenophobia and so on. But I still think that the reconnection, the lifting of the Iron Curtain and the reconnection of the East Central Europe to Central and Western Europe was a tremendous transformation. Now, the price of all of this has been a tremendous wrenching adjustment that was underestimated in the heady days of '89 and during the celebrations. It's basically the inevitable hangover that came out of too much champagne, after the meeting, on November 9th, November 10th in Berlin. Western-style democracy has turned out to be a distant and cumbersome process. The double transition from plan to market and from protected semi-barter, non-currency convertible economies to global competition has been fierce and has created massive unemployment, not only in Germany. The Germans have had the advantage of massive financial transfers, about 1.6 trillion euros. I said that yesterday alone. But even those were not enough to create the so-called flourishing landscapes. And on top of it, the tremendous psychological adjustment of a population used to tutelage, and control. Okay. If this wasn't a revolutionary change, then I don't know what a revolution is. It's, of course, a question of your definition. Now, let me say two more words in conclusion. One of them is on the interplay of the actors. You have dissidents, you have silent majority, you have communist party apparatchiks, and you have people on the international system, okay? And the interpretive challenge is the mapping of their interaction, okay? All of these are important, and any mythological explanation that claims only one of them, that fastens on one of them, is, I think, too simple. Okay. The second point is the concept that comes closest to describing the events is, in my mind, a new kind of revolution, which is a peaceful one, the result of civil resistance, driven by demands for fundamental political, economic, and social change. That in the German case also involves a national dimension. It is a new model. Of course, it comes out of an attempt to liberalize communism. And unlike in 53, 56, 68, or 81, it succeeds because it is not stopped by force. Is this model exportable? It has been exported maybe to South Africa, maybe to the Ukraine, maybe to Serbia and some other places, but it is not a panacea because it has also failed in China, in Iran, and in other places. So there the conceptual challenge is figuring out what are the special circumstances under which it might succeed and which are the circumstances under which it will fail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jarosz. Just a couple of words of commentary before we throw it open to general discussion, since I was asked to start off our questions and discussion. I think one is struck in all of these very fine papers and the excellent presentations by the degree to which 20 years makes a great deal of difference in the way that we think about historical experience. And let me just make three very brief points in that regard. First has to do with the revolutionariness, if you like, of 1989, the degree to which the idea of revolution is critical now 2 decades on to understanding what happened in that year. Very rarely is it the case that anyone who lives through a revolution thinks that he or she is living through a revolution at the time. Any place outside of Petrograd in 1917, I think one would have been hard-pressed to understand that you were living through something that we would now call, or later call, the Russian Revolution. The oddity of 1989 is that, at least as I recall, most people believed they were living through a revolution at the time, and it looks less revolutionary as we go on. I mean, it has exactly the opposite kind of characteristic to what most other social revolutions have. The more time that goes on, the more we question the degree to which it was, in fact, revolutionary change, even though it seemed to be at the time. What form does that take? I think in the different papers it takes different forms. Tom Gallagher's very fine critique of the post-revolutionary situation in Romania, to Vlad Zubok's critique of the role of our understanding of the role of Gorbachev in the revolutions, I think fall into this camp perhaps. Francois Furet was fond of defining revolution among other things as an event that produces a grand new organizing idea. And it's tempting, I think it was tempting in '89, it's been tempting in the 20 years since to focus on the particular revolutionary ideas that came out of the experience of that year, the idea of liberalism, the idea of human rights, of European values, re-emerging in a part of Europe, especially in Central Europe, in which they had long seemed absent. But as I think we're reminded, particularly in the Jarosz presentation, there were a set of other revolutionary ideas that perhaps as the 1990s progressed turned out to be even more significant in the region, depending on which bit of the region you're focusing on. Ideas like nationalism, ethnic chauvinism, and so on, which had just as revolutionary effect on particular parts of Europe as the more humane values that were seen in other bits. On the idea of revolution, too, and reading the papers and listening to the presentations, I was struck by Ernest Gellner's famous idea of the time zones of Europe. That is, the degree to which national awakening and national consciousness flows across Europe in a kind of west to east wave. And depending on where you are in that particular time zone, that you come to the idea of the nation at different periods in time. There was in 1989, and the way we interpret those events, or have interpreted them in the last 20 years, something of the same idea we might call the time zones of revolution. Because depending on where you are, the model of 1989, or the 1989 is a model of different kind of revolution, looks very, very different. One could argue that that for Czechs and in Czechoslovakia of the day, 1789 was the kind of model. In Poland, it looked much more like 1848 than 1789. In Germany, it was the precursor to a new kind of 1871. And of course, in Yugoslavia, the period from 1917 to 1921, the period of the Russian Revolution and Russian Civil War, looks much more like the model that was followed in Yugoslavia. The point being that the idea of revolution, even at the time, was not just one thing. There were different kinds of revolutions and different kinds of models happening, as much as we might think of 1989 as being primarily about the wall, the magic lantern, and so on. There were plenty of other kinds of revolution in the air. Second point that comes out particularly in the Blanton presentation and in Tom Gallagher's presentation, the power and weakness of the idea of Europe. That has changed so much over the past 20 years. The critical nature of Europe as an idea, but not as a place and not as a set of institutions, but as a disembodied set of values in 1989. Critical in Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and in Poland to a degree, and in Romania, Bulgaria as well. Later, however, the European idea gets traded, it seems to me, for Europe as a set of institutions and Europe as a set of benchmarks and bureaucratic processes that turn out to be perhaps equally powerful in the way that countries pull themselves out of the chaos of 1989 and try to chart a path toward that Europe whole and free. The irony today, of course, that one of the birthplaces of the critical idea of Europe in 1989, the Czech Republic, turns out to be one of the great holdouts on the idea of EU deepening, is essential to the way that we think about the power and weakness of Europe as an idea. And finally, the role of Gorbachev and more generally the Soviet experience in all of this. At the time, I think everyone believed that it was crucial, as Vlad Zubok's paper tries to argue, the critical nature, at least of Gorbachev, perhaps not of the Soviet Union or the Soviet experience more broadly. The role of Gorbachev perhaps needs to be questioned. But I think that how we assess Gorbachev's particular role depends to a great degree on when we start the narrative, because there was a real self-reflexive power to the ideas that were emanating from Moscow, because, of course, the people who were feeding ideas to Gorbachev had themselves drawn a lot of their ideas from the Central European experience in the 1960s. So there's a return of perestroika to Central Europe, not simply the exporting of perestroika from Moscow. There is a sort of cyclical process at work here that Archie Brown and others have talked about. Gorbachev's role, though, I think, or the Soviet role more broadly, really had to do, in my mind, with the idea of opening up space for two issues to be debated that had squelched monumental change in 1956 and in 1968. One of those is the role of the leading role of the Communist Party or its avatars across the region, which I think was critical. And secondly, the place of states within the Warsaw Pact. Once those issues could be elaborated, if only in code, the road, I think, was open for really monumental change. Well, we'll now open it up to questions and comments. If you would please just identify yourself as well when you ask a question. Just
Jim Norton, no particular affiliation at the moment. Hope to have one soon. I guess this should be directed to the entire panel, but I'm wondering why national leaders, I mean, they have their own agenda for doing so, but why in academia is there such a resistance to acknowledging some of what some of you have acknowledged today, which is that the revolutions of '89 seem to have been a very complex confluence of events that went back a long time, say with the Helsinki Accords, and maybe that's what brought about the nonviolent change, that the focus on the rule of law as being the foundation for change. But it can't be exported, it couldn't be duplicated, because it was all these things. It was the influence of Gorbachev, it was the influence of Reagan, it was the influence of Bush, it was the influence of Solidarity. It was a combination of all of these things. One thing I never hear about, and perhaps all of you could touch on this, but particularly is
I put new batteries in them this morning.
We're agreeing about new batteries their role in the revolution. Andropov is widely accepted, sort of handpicked Gorbachev. And with his previous experience as director of KGB, he certainly had the ability to see out in what was maybe happening and perhaps the foresight to see that the collapse of communism was inevitable. Do you think Andropov had a role in picking Gorbachev and putting the strength behind him to push perestroika and these sorts of things that eventually brought communism down?
Thank you. Since we've got several people on the list and we've got about 15 minutes for discussion, I want to take a couple of points. Just here and then Jorge Roman. Just wait for the mic if you wouldn't mind. Thank you.
We on? Ross Johnson, Wilson Center. Three comments/questions. I suppose first to Tom. Indeed, I mean, I too would subscribe to Garton Ash's words. The great powers did a great service by doing very little. But how about the next phase? And one could argue. I would argue that. The active role of the United States in promoting German unification, unlike the position of its major allies, was just a crucial element here. And without that, things would have been worse rather than better a year and two down the road. Second point is, and coming to some of the build-up to 89 is the climax, or the real issue here, and acknowledging the very important points that Vlad Zubok has made about Gorbachev and going back to 85 and the impact in Eastern Europe. 87, 88 is really the key period in Eastern Europe. Let me suggest more attention to that. As one can cite so many examples of a system in decay that allowed this space to be created. I cited the example last night that in 1988, Radio Free Europe could on the telephone interview 190 prominent individuals in Poland, unthinkable 2 years before that. Or in a conference in East Berlin in the end of 1988 with East German military and political elite completely at sea, not knowing where to go. And the conclusion of all that would be there's no perestroika in Eastern Europe. These are communist systems who don't have a clue about what to do next. It's just some kind of defensive huddling. Or I like the phrase of Jakeš, the last Czechoslovak Communist Party leader. I think I'm the last post in the fence. I mean, that was the extent of the sort of conceptual thinking at that time. And then finally, a caution, I'm sure we all share, a caution against retrospective determinism here. Yes, a lot of things predisposed the outcome in the way that it was and nonviolent, but so many things could have gone wrong at any particular point. I happened to see the first German television docudrama of the day the wall fell last week, and just at so many points, somebody could have done the wrong thing, and things could have spiraled out of control. So luck also played a great role, I think.
Jorge Roman Potapievic.
Thank you. I would like to thank you all for the inspiring quality of your contributions. I would like to address Thomas Blanton a testimony coming from Romania, an ex-communist country. I was a little bit surprised by your reluctance to accept Ronald Reagan's role in the collapse of the communist regime. My testimony would be that, in my country, and I suspect that in other communist, ex-communist countries as well, we had some heroes. They were Western heroes, and their names are Ronald Reagan, the Pope John Paul II, Margaret Thatcher, and Helmut Kohl, because we perceived them as our allies. Quite the contrary, we perceived the Kremlinologists, people from the academia, as completely misunderstanding what we societies under communist rule wanted. So I would like a restoration in their reputation for those Western leaders. We truly believed their political actions were crucial to our emancipation from a communist regime. So once again, I would like symbolically to thank to Ronald Reagan, to Pope John Paul II, to Margaret Thatcher, and to Helmut Kohl.
Thanks. Just, I'm sorry, not to interrupt.
I would like to make another comment to Władysław Zubok, fine presentation of the role of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. And I would like to say only this. When we regard at communist leaders, what strikes us is they committed to a politic of crime. They don't hesitate to kill people in order to promote their ideas. Whereas Mikhail Gorbachev is a kind of communist leader who is reluctant to commit crimes in order to achieve its goals. And I think psychologically it's a big difference between him, Andropov, Brezhnev, Khrushchev, and Lenin. Nicolae Ceausescu was a communist, an old communist in that sense. He doesn't hesitate to kill people, whereas Gorbachev has this hesitation, and I praise him from that. As for the nature of the revolution, I agree completely with Konrad Jarausz. It was a revolution, and the outcome of the upheaval of the population and the work of the dissidents and the work of some of the apparatchik was enormous. It was a complete reversal of the state of affairs in those countries. But what people in ex-communist countries wanted was not a revolution of the kind of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. And they didn't want to make a counter-revolution. And I remember a phrase of a famous reactionary, Joseph de Maistre. He said that what we, reactionary in France, really want to do, it's not a counter-revolution, it's the contrary of a revolution. It was to deny the very principle of a revolution of a French Revolution type. Because what people in Eastern countries wanted was a parliamentary regime, which is not revolution to have one. It was free market economy, capitalism. They wanted to be citizens in the old liberal sense of the term. So central values, not extreme right or extreme left values. It was the very central core of the modernity in Europe. So they didn't want a revolution. They want the contrary of a revolution.
Thank you very much. We'll take two very brief comments here, and Vladimir Tismanov, and then we'll open it up back to the panel.
My name is Stephen Shore. To get back to one event that no one mentioned, I think it was early in 1988 that Gorbachev explicitly renounced the Brezhnev doctrine when he might have pursued a policy of studied ambiguity, and then to make it absolutely clear that Americans would not forget this promise, Gennady Gerasimov nicknamed it the Sinatra Doctrine, which made it very easy for Americans in particular to remember. And while this did not necessarily mean that when push came to shove that the policy would not be reversed, nonetheless, of going public months and choosing to publicly repudiate the Brezhnev Doctrine and making it clear, repeating it and popularizing the repudiation, I think did have some effects of what was to come.
Thanks. Vladimir Tismanov, and then we'll turn it back to the panel.
Does it work? Okay, thank you very much. Actually, I agree with what Horia said. Probably we can prolong a little bit the list of people that could be identified as sources of encouragement and inspiration. I would add to the list, probably people may be a little bit surprised, but I would add definitely to the list Jimmy Carter and the centrality of human rights during the mandate of Jimmy Carter. I always tell my friends and students, I keep repeating, before Jimmy Carter there was no human rights officer or human rights desk in any American embassy in the world, which means that people who were under duress and so on had no place to go to that particular, somebody to care about this issue. So I think that, surprisingly, these two Wilsonian presidents, since we are in the Woodrow Wilson Plaza here in the Woodrow Wilson Center, both Carter and Reagan, I think, was their internationalism in the foreign policy played an important role. I would add this. Three very, very brief points. Immediately after the revolutions of 1989, I was one of the editors of East European Reporter, London-based quarterly. The editor was Jan Kavan, who became a very important figure in all the discussion that was to follow. Some of you know, I'm not going to elaborate about that. Anyway, so we published a wonderful text by Adam Michnik, which was actually written for a conference that together with Mircea Mihaish, where is Mircea? He's not here. We organized in Timișoara, 1990, I think, and it was, Agnes was there, and it was, Michnik sent the piece, and it was called The Presence of Liberal Values. It's a very interesting text because Michnik would not, we have here the translator of Michnik's letters from prison, Maja Latinsky. Michnik would not repeat, but in 1990 Michnik mentions, I quote from memory, I'll go back home and check, but one of the most important references, and there are three. One is Tocqueville, one is, I think, Isaiah Berlin, and one is Hayek. It's, I think, one of the very few texts by Michnik in which he identifies Hayek's ideas as a main source for the dissident thinking of East Central Europe. I wanted this to be mentioned. Second important point, I think, since Furet's name was mentioned here, his most important work, obviously, in addition to deconspiring or exposing the communist illusion in the 20th century, his important work as a historian, not only a historian of illusions, but of revolutions, is, of course, the French Revolution. And I think we should apply the Furetian principle, or if you want the Furetian hypothesis, let's call it this way, in dealing with 89, as Furet proposed. La révolution n'est pas un bloc. So revolution is not a block. It's fragmented. There are different narratives, different discourses, different competing, what we call those was, and I'm very happy to have Konrad Jarausch here, who work on memory regimes. I mean, there are rivaling or competing memory regimes. People remember those things very differently. And since Gorbachev's name, let's see how we remember Gorbachev. In a very famous interview in the spring of 1989, now, dissidents, it's a long story. We can probably next year, if we have still the money to do such a thing, probably we should look into the legacies of the dissident thought. In a very famous interview with Libération, which is everybody knows, a French newspaper, at that moment, one of the major, important Romanian dissidents, Mircea Dinescu, the poet, said, and this has nothing to do with contemporary Dinescu, we speak about 1989 Dinescu, he said, I don't know what for you in the West or in other places Gorbachev means. And I know, Vladi, you reviewed my studies, but I actually quote this in Studies for All Seasons. But for us, the denizens of the totalitarian barracks, Gorbachev is the messiah of socialism with a human face. This is in April 1989. Following that, Dinescu is under house arrest, and he's the guy, apropos of the book that we are going to launch tonight, Dracula is Dead, he's the guy who appears on Romanian television to announce that Dracula left Bucharest, etc. So that would happen a few months later. So we have to think like those. Probably this is the challenge that Konrad Jarausch mentioned, of challenges for interpretation. How do we think, not like us, not like the New York Times of yesterday and so on, but like those who indeed, because this is what Horia mentioned, when do we pass, and he didn't mention, he could tell us more, because he passed the threshold of fear. He was arrested during the night of 20th to the 21st, no, whatever the night, and nobody knew in that particular, that's the way Politice starts, I think, with the letters to Paleologu, and it's, that's the moment when you don't know. The whole thing can end up with being executed, like the people in Timișoara who were executed. I mean, those corpses in Timișoara, no matter how we look into myth and mystification of Romanian Revolution, they were real. I mean, that was a real thing. Okay, thank you.
We'll give each of our panelists a chance to respond. There's a lot on the table. You can pick and choose whatever you like. Shall we just start at that end of the table with Tom Blanton, and then...
A profound point about heroes, and I'm influenced here just by some great work by a George Washington University graduate student, Greg Domber, who did a dissertation about the interaction between U.S. support for solidarity and what it actually amounted to. And where was the inspiration, where was the leadership, what were the flows? And he ultimately concluded, and I think I share this, that in fact the inspiration came in the other direction. It's quite easy for an American leader to stand up and make pronouncements in front of the Brandenburg Gate when he risks nothing on his personal life. And
not true.
Not true. Kennedy did. Every president denounced the wall. I mean, it's just Reagan had a better sense of theater than most of them. He was an actor. No, I think it's his biographer called it the role of a lifetime, and I think that's correct about Reagan. The point I would make is not to deny the impact of Thatcher or Kohl, and certainly the Pope. I think the Pope had different standing. The Pope had personal experience of persecution and keeping the church alive in a very difficult situation. But I think for an American to sit in a very comfortable chair, or an American leader to sit in a very comfortable cocoon and claim moral leadership is a stretch. Is a great stretch when people in Eastern Europe are suffering and going to prison or being arrested for pushing the envelope. And so when I create a pantheon of heroism, I somehow don't feel comfortable putting comfortable Western leaders on that list, except perhaps for the Pope because of his own personal lifetime experience. I think the inspiration in many respects came in the other direction, and this is one of the great roles that Radio Free Europe and the radios played, which was in effect to magnify and broadcast back precisely the moral leadership and the chance-taking, the courage. What was the comment at yesterday's conference? Somebody made a comment about heroism and how heroism also requires stupidity. Well, it's not in your self-interest to commit yourself to prison. It wasn't in people's self-interest to sign the charter, but they did it as a statement. That, to me, is a more heroic statement than a presidential speech. That's my only real response.
Okay, just a sentence on Helsinki, because that was asked about before. I think, judging by the conversations between Honecker and Brezhnev, which Hans-Hermann Hertle and I edited, the communist leaders, disastrously underestimated the effects of Basket 3. They didn't understand it. There was an internal human rights commission in the GDR to make the GDR look more acceptable to the West, and so on. But and in all the conversations and so on, with all the hundreds of pages, there are only 2 or 3 paragraphs when they talk about the dissidents at all, which is astounding. I mean, they're not seeing them. And, when you underestimate something, you can also be caught by it. The second point is, I think, one of your questions has to do also with the issue of the hero question can be turned also into an Ostpolitik question. That is, that you needed heroes to be inspired and to continue to have hope is fine, And then you have to sort of attribute qualities to them, from the outside. But, that there are other people who are making the Iron Curtain more permeable, so that there is exchange of ideas, and so that the communists can also retreat afterwards without fearing that they will be massacred and so on, is, I think, another dimension. And in the German context, the SPD had a tremendous Ostpolitik that softened the Iron Curtain with the policy of little steps and so on, but they somewhere lost sight of the goal of overthrowing communism. And the CDU had tremendous rhetoric about overthrowing communism and commitment, and they had no clue how to do it. So in my opinion, is a pest on both of their houses. That is, it needed both of them. It needed some people to be staunchly anti-communist, and it needed some other people to be actually working with communication and so on across the Iron Curtain to soften up the opposition. Finally, on the idea question of revolution, I think, the Habermasian quote is in some ways, damning the nachholende Revolution, the catch-up revolution. There are aspects of that, but what Western intellectuals were looking for are the civil society elements and the sort of courage elements that, Tom just talked about. The question is, did they really want a kind of, sort of a second-rate, repeat of Western democracy and Western capitalism, or didn't they really want something that would even go beyond that? And I think some of the disappointment after the change is that what they've got, is a kind of, if they're lucky, they've got a normal Western, market capitalism and democracy rather than what they were aiming for, which was something more participatory, more direct, more inspiring, and so on.
Tom Gallagher?
Just a very brief point in relation, I think, to the second contributor who made the remark that great powers did a great service by doing very little. I think there was far more loss of life as a result of organised political violence in the 1990s in Eastern Europe than there was at any point between the 1950s and the 1980s. And that occurred, of course, in the former Yugoslavia. And in many ways, a lot of the fruits of the collapse of communism were dissipated by the minimalist, very introspective attitude of the Euro-Atlantic powers. And it was the first, I think, Prime Minister of the transition government in Poland, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, who ended up in the middle of the Bosnian War as the UN Human Rights Commissioner in Bosnia, and who pleaded in Washington and in the EU capitals for the leaders, second rank, I think, John Major replacing Thatcher, George Bush Sr. replacing Reagan, to remember the ideals that had, enabled the West to show solidarity with downtrodden people in Eastern Europe, and he got no coherent answer. So I think I just disagree with that remark.
One word to Vlad Zubok.
Okay, I heard this word KGB, and that came up pretty often, I guess, yesterday too. And it is another remarkable phenomenon of the dog that didn't bark. And I can say that intelligence services, even in totalitarian states, set up to prop the regime, but they're not set up to foresee and prevent revolutions. And in this case, the KGB was a remarkably inept organization that couldn't foresee what was happening and was basically encapsulated in its own ossified structural and mental ways. Total failure. That's what at least the documents show. In terms of Andropov, I mean, he made one great gift to history. He appointed Gorbachev, of course, and that, of course, shows his remarkable lack of foresight of what would happen. And he couldn't have appointed the best person to destroy the Soviet Union and Soviet communism, as it turned out. Any other choice would have probably kept the Soviet Union intact. So we come back to that enigma of Gorbachev and his lack of plan, his lack of strategy. I do not imply, by the way, that when I say that he lacked goals and he lacked policy for Eastern Europe and the revolution, that he missed an option to use force or threatened to put a brake on the revolution developments. What we find actually before the end of '89, before Malta, Gorbachev never explicitly repudiated the Brezhnev doctrine. He's remarkably reticent in making if together with Bush, who didn't want to dance on the wall, Gorbachev never wanted to dance on any Eastern European regimes. He never wanted to rock the boat, and it was during the same time that Gorbachev almost with other actions, implicitly, not explicitly, went beyond repudiation of the Brezhnev doctrine towards a much more messianic project of a common European home. So that's why it's always difficult to evaluate Mikhail Sergeyevich. I mean, I might say that for simplicity's sake, Gorbachev is reviled by many in Russia because he destroyed the Soviet Union. He is revered in the West because he basically,
did whatever the West could only dream of. And he's a contested figure in Eastern Europe because on one hand he was for socialism with a human face, on the other hand he didn't use violence. So I guess Eastern Europeans will be always hesitant whether to erect or not to erect a pedestal for Gorbachev, unlike Reagan.